Welcome to the First 90 podcast, where we discuss strategies to improve employee onboarding. Today, we're talking with Iris McQuillian-Grace. She is the Global Head of Employee Experience at Oliver Agency. Welcome to the podcast, Iris.
Thank you for having me.
Let's get to know you a little bit. Tell us about your very first job that you had.
Well, I think like most HR professionals, I started by teaching Shakespeare in a maximum security facility group home for young women between the ages of 12 and 18. So I think a lot of people have that entry point to working in corporate HR.
So I've heard that's a standard entry point.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So my first job was doing that and I loved it. I often joke now working with executives that, my frame of reference is my very first day teaching, I showed up. I also had never been a teacher before, right?
Okay.
So
Yep.
some of this is salient, right, to our later discussion of, are we setting up our new employees for success, right? I had no handbook. I had no understanding. I knew I had gone to get fingerprinted because I was a teacher and that was the state regulation, and that I was going to be teaching Romeo and Juliet. So I had, the source material and I had read it, but I had never been a teacher. I knew nothing about the school. I knew nothing about my students. I just sort of showed up and they were all sitting together and each of them had a security guard. Okay. So it was a 1-for-1. And there were small classes. There were only 6 of them, right? So it was 8 hours of 6 at a time. And there was a buddy for each of them, right? And one of my students kept slamming the chair. And I said, please stop doing that. And she said, I'm going to throw this at this chair at your face. And I don't know why I said this. But what I said was, if you were going to do that, you would have done it already. So please sit down or leave the classroom. This is not a mandatory experience for you. You are welcome to leave. And I completed the class. I walked right to the bathroom. I looked in the mirror and I thought this to myself. I was like, you are not Michelle Pfeiffer. This is not Dangerous Minds. Like, what are you doing? And I sort of like splashed some water in my face and I I found it within myself. And I finished the day. But the thing that I learned the most that has actually sort of supported my designing, and maybe a reason I care so much about human-centered design and about onboarding and setting people up for that first experience, that first day, is having had the experience of having none of that, right? A very different environment, a very different role, notwithstanding. But I remember what it was like to go home and sort of do that wash up for myself. What am I going to do tomorrow? And realizing that I was really directing what my onboarding looked like. And only now, having worked in HR for as long as I have, do I understand that not everyone is set up to think that way, has the same agency I did, because depending on what level or role they're coming into in an organization, and isn't in a position to take back and empower themselves to onboard themselves in a self-contained way, right?
Right.
So that's how I started.
That is an amazing story. I think we could spend a whole podcast. I have so many questions I want to ask to dig into how you actually got that job, but we'll do maybe a part 2 one of these days. We'll go deep into that. But you already mentioned human-centered design. That's your background. Mm-hmm. Let's just start by defining what is human-centered design.
Human-centered design, or HCD, right, is a methodology that places the user at the heart of the design process. 2 things I want to say about that. My entry point to human-centered design, right, was my experience as being a Shakespeare and theater teacher, right? So applying and so that's what I sort of entered experientially as I encountered HCD, and it gave me a corporate language for some of my previous background. The second thing is that I would argue that it's not useless, but it feels less operational if you don't pair it with something else. So say design thinking, right? And you're running, those more tactical sort of aspects, right? But layering them together can be incredibly powerful, especially for those of us in human resources, right? I think in the context of what employee experience is, certainly in my role, we are talking about centering employees across all of those touch points on the employee life cycle. Onboarding is only one of them, right? Another way maybe to think about attaching human-centered design is, I know there are some folks who are talking about applying a product management lens to the people space, right? And I would say that's excellent. I would still encourage a human-centered design sort of layer on top of that, right? You'll hear constantly that employees are being referred to as any organization's greatest resource. I would posit the question after that sentence is said about, if employees are our greatest resource, are we centering humans, which are what employees are made of currently? Are we centering real human beings when we are designing and iterating all of these processes?
That makes a lot of sense. I come from a product management background, so obviously human-centered design plays into it. And when we talk about it, a lot of times it feels really obvious. It's like, of course, we want to design software applications to be centered around humans. That's who's going to use it. But what happens in reality a lot is that business outcomes start to trump everything
Mm-hmm.
else. And that's why when
Mm-hmm.
you use a software, you're using an app and you realize this is annoying. It's annoying that I keep getting this upgrade modal every, you know,
Mm-hmm.
3 minutes, or this doesn't make sense. A lot of times that's because people suddenly start to only optimize for business outcomes and revenue. And that obviously matters. Businesses
Mm-hmm.
need to make revenue. But when it starts to it starts to take the place of human-centered designs, and we start to put that in front of thinking about people and what's that ideal experience, that's when things get really messy. And so I love how you're taking this and thinking about it in the terms of onboarding. So maybe expand on that a little bit. How do we actually apply it to employee onboarding?
It's a great question, because you can get lost in the sauce of, oh, we do it and we do it for everything, but then it starts to mean nothing, right? And I think the critical piece about onboarding is you have an acute opportunity to really get someone to drink your proverbial Kool-Aid, right? And I think that's so powerful when we look at measures for retention and loyalty, but also innovation, right? And productivity, effectiveness with you in the organization. And so when we're designing onboarding and applying a human-centered lens, I think the marriage there results in someone who understands and enculturates into the organization's mission, vision, values, ways of working, rituals, whatever, right? The systems we're using, the platforms we're using, but also the sort of those intangibles, maybe, right? As we're mapping out what we want someone to learn and understand, there's that out even can be a place to start. So how are we mapping that user experience, I would say, right, is one place to start. I would say the sort of the critical step before we start to design the process, though, right, about onboarding is, do we have enough user data and research? Do we have enough touch points? Have we done enough, whether it's roundtables or one-on-one interviews? And that's the part where that human-centered design piece can really inform who you're inviting to those conversations, right? So I would encourage folks to think about not just your current employees, but if you could get, people who said no in the recruitment process, people, right? People who are leaving, right? Are you looking at the entire compendium of who you want to attract, who is currently here, right? And then breaking that out even further across employee segment. So ICs, middle managers, senior leaders. And then are there any additional sort of, from a DEIB lens, are we taking into consideration any accommodations for neurodiversity? Are we taking in accommodations for any physical accommodations that we should be thoughtful of? Are we taking into consideration people's walks of life before they enter, people returning to or re-onboarding to the organization, coming back from any sort of leave, right? All of that, like onboarding to a new role, right? See, it just starts to, right? And you want to get lost in the sauce in this part. I would encourage full abandon, put it all on a whiteboard, right? Get it all in the room, get all your stakeholders together, put it all out, and start to map out what that should look like. Obviously, you may or may not need to prioritize, right? You'll get pie in the sky, but then it becomes a driving like light to say, okay, right, and this is how we'll start to measure, and these are the metrics we'll use, and this is why it's important, and this is right, where having consistency around using human-centered design with your stakeholders also gets enough, I have found, generates the buy-in necessary to run through that exercise. Who are we really designing onboarding for? And then we can decide what the process looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen across your career, you've worked at companies and you've implemented human-centered design. And I believe you're still in your current role, you're working on building this out. And actually, you're going through that process. But if we think about some of the companies you've worked at where you've established this, what results have you seen with this process?
So I think the immediate, right, were upticks in engagement scores. We also saw a longer term, right, over time, we were able to measure against increases in productivity and innovation, which I sort of cited in that previous response. I think the other piece that we've found to help with those outcomes, right, is designing programs that didn't just take into consideration all of those identities, but took into consideration the team dynamics that people were coming into as well, right? So once you've identified what the user looks like, you're also who is part of that user group is also the teams that people are coming into. It's not just, right? Don't stop the ideation or the consideration in the design process, the new person coming in. Also consider the team that they're joining, so that teams are able to work more effectively, faster, and more quickly, right? We're able to, move people through to true collaboration much faster, then to iteration, disruption, and innovation that much faster, right? Because we're able to get people really up to speed in it's just light years faster than I've seen prior to doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you've been doing this, all of this sounds amazing. All this is amazing results that you've seen,
Yeah.
but there's probably pushback. Anytime you're trying to change processes or how things are done, you've probably experienced pushback in an organization. So as you've done this, what have people said? What's kind of the pushback that you've had to deal with that someone listening might need to prepare for if they want to copy this or start to implement some of human-centered design principles?
Two things. So the quick story, first time I pitched this as an idea, my CHRO said it just wasn't a priority, right? The argument that they made to me was, this is fine, this works, it's onboarding, this isn't like, we're not curing cancer, we're just bringing somebody in. And I was like, okay. And so the solve, as I'm sure everyone listening and you has already encountered, it was just like a good reminder that when bringing something to a senior stakeholder or to any stakeholder is to package the pitch to how somebody needs that information, right? So I presented it in a way that felt, and that just wasn't effective. So I went back to the drawing board and I pulled the data and built the business case and like identified why we should make it a priority, and then sort of built it out and framed it in a way that demonstrated how we track progress, how we would measure effectiveness, the lift it would take, the budget associated. I really built it out. It didn't just, I think part of the reason looking back that it was not successful in that first is that I took for granted and made the assumption, and this is the call out, right? I made the assumption because it was important to me, it would be important to my CHRO, right? So I think the pushback I got made total sense upon reflection because I didn't do the work necessary to make it undeniably clear why it should be a priority to the organization, right? So that was the sort of lesson learned and that initial pushback that I did receive. Once I was able to demonstrate that, we were off and running, right?
I want to repeat something you said because I think it's so key. It's you needed to package it and present it in a way that the upper management, the stakeholders could receive it in a way and actually digest it. I think that's so key to anything that we're trying to change within the organization. A lot of times in our minds, we're like, this is such a good idea. There's no downside to this. Like, why can't people just understand why we need to do this? Or we might take it a little personally and be like, oh, they're just not listening to me, and we internalize it. But what you said is so key. It's how you package and present it can completely change how an idea or how a process is going to be received. So I think that's the big takeaway, so far for people listening, whatever they're trying to implement, whether it's human-centered design or any other thing to change onboarding, think about how that needs to be presented if you're going to make that change within the organization.
Feels like table stakes. Like you say it out loud and you're like, that makes sense. Like what? Right. But I think because we're human beings, right? And sort of now as I'm sharing this story with you, it occurs to me, had I put my own HCD hat on and I'd done understood my consumer. Oh, obviously you need this like this, but I didn't. Right. So I think I'm still learning that lesson. If anybody does that automatically, holler at me about they need to be on your podcast, right? But yes.
Hey, one of the best things you can do for new employees is to give them a plan for their first 90 days. That's why we developed the First 90 Daily Planner. It gives new employees exercises every day for their first 3 months and a place to take notes as they're onboarding into their job. And because you listen to the podcast, we're giving it to you today for free. Go to 1490.com/planner to download your free PDF copy of it today. That's 14nynety.com/planner. So someone that is thinking about using human-centered design, they've heard all of this, they want to do it. What systems do you keep in place to make sure this happens, to make sure day in and day out, new hires, that this happens for your new hires? Is there any systems that you try to have that contains all of this?
When I hear systems now in this context, it sounds like we're talking about like, do I like an HRIS or do I like Airtable or do I like Planner or do I like that? If that's the question, then the answer is no, because I feel like system agnostically, right? Like you need to run, again, sort of to that prior sort of like falling on my sword, I didn't do it in the way we thought, right? Like I wouldn't advocate you only do human-centered design using this like platform because it'll die on the vine, right? So I would say lean into the systems and the ways of working that are already established, provided they're working, right? At your organization. The sort of fail safes and the way that I would think about ensuring sort of like quality testing, right? Or, keeping the trains on the tracks, however we want to say it, to make sure that onboarding is still happening and being considered in this way, right? Is you've done all this work, you've done your research, you started to build your user maps, you've started to build out the process, right? What are the metrics you're tracking to make sure that onboarding is effective? Is it surveys? Is it focus groups? Is it your engagement surveys, performance reviews, right? What are those data sets, those checkpoints, right? Are you going to build an onboarding buddy and then you'll have a survey through them so you have some 360 feedback that you can consider about your onboarding process, right? What are you, right? And that's one piece, right? That's one of the systems that I would think of to use to just sort of quality check to see that it's still happening and to see that it's effective. Because I wouldn't advocate that you run it into the ground, right? Like you want to keep this lean and agile because there's a new change here, right? So if you make the decision to do this, and holler at me if you do, because I would love everyone to start doing this, I would say pilot it, right? One of the tenets of design thinking, right, and human-centered design is that you're piloting and ideating, and this is a continuum. This is going to be the vibe forever. It's not set it and forget it, right? So start small, maybe depending on your size of the organization, run it a few times, validate some assumptions, test it out with an audience, come back, right? Keep it lean, and then start to scale from there, right? But make sure your line of sight is, what are the ways we're going to know this is effective? Do those need to change? Let's get clear, go back to the drawing board in that testing process, right? But make sure that that's the way. If when I hear systems, that's what I would advocate for. How you operationalize that is the joy and the beauty of working within this model, right? Is that it will work for wherever you are.
Any last advice for someone who's listening? We've talked about packaging it to senior leadership. You've talked about having ways to measure and then know if it's working and then expanding it. Any last advice for someone who wants to start to get into applying human-centered design to their onboarding?
ask forgiveness, not permission. What I mean when I say that is, I have worked in organizations where I have been really transparent and led with HCD at the front. But I also have worked in organizations where I'm doing that work, I'm just not talking about it. So if this is something you're interested in, there are so many resources. Jump in the pool, start small, get comfortable, and maybe your organization, because I can't speak to who the people, the appetite within your organization and what it would look like to accept and adopt this really formally, right? So maybe you need to be running it for a few things, and then you can lift your head up and say, BT dubs, guys, we've been doing this the whole time, right? Or maybe you work somewhere, you're like, I just saw this, I took this, I saw this, can we try it, right? So when I say ask forgiveness, not permission, that I mean, there should be no reason for you to feel like you have to wait for permission to begin to use this framework, right? You know, IDEO runs courses on, or they used to, Coursera, right? So if you, IDEO is where I learned cut my formal teeth on HCD. That's totally available to you. I know BCG runs, like if you're looking for a cred, they run a human-centered design boot camp. You're going to drop in Jess's book. Jess wrote a book called Built for People, which we're going to talk about. McKinsey wrote an article in 2021. There are some people who are talking about this, right? And there are some communities of practice that are being established around bringing HCD into the people space. So this is available. This is, free. It's low cost, but I have seen to have tremendous impact. So I hope that people feel excited to try it in their own people practices.
And that's a perfect lead into our final questions here. So let's start with, what book do you recommend the most?
So you're going to drop in the chat, but it's Jess's book, Jesse, Built for People, Transform Your Employee Experiences Using Product Management Principles.
Amazing. Yes, we'll include that in the show notes.
Yeah.
And then what interview question do you like asking the most or including?
Okay. So I spent 3 years working at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and I stood up their TA function while I was there. And this was like maybe my all-time top 5 favorite question to ask. To be fair, no one's ever asked me this question. But it's, tell me about a time when something went sideways, right? While you were working on a project. What was the project? What went sideways? What did you do to reroute in the moment, right? To get things back on track. And when it was all said and done, you could take a breath, right? What did you do different next time?
That's great. Well, Iris, this has been a great conversation. There's lots of tangible advice you've put in here. But if someone wants to learn more, they want to learn more from you, how can they connect with you? How can they reach out and, potentially have a longer conversation about this? Or how can people be helpful to you?
Sure. I mean, the ask I would make is, anybody listening to this, if you decide to begin to leverage HCD in your people practice, please let me know. I'm a nerd for this stuff. Like, I really want to know if people are doing it. And then I want us all to learn from each other, right? Like, so please reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to make myself available.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast. We really
Thanks for
enjoyed this
having me.
conversation,
Yeah.
and appreciate you sharing your wisdom today.